Good morning. Happy Wednesday. We are in Hebrews 9:16 through 28 this morning. This is the second half of Hebrews 9. I'm on a swivelly chair. I'm sorry. I will do my best to stop. It's got some recalls to Old Testament passages, and it's a little bit long, so just stick with it here. So this is Hebrews 9, starting in verse 16. Now where there is a will, the death of the testator must be established. For a will takes effect only at death. It has no force while the testator is alive. Thus, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. When every commandment had been proclaimed by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats, together with water and crimson wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has enjoined upon you." In the same way, he sprinkled also the tabernacle and all the vessels of worship with the blood. According to the law, almost everything is purified by blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. Therefore, it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified by these rites, but the heavenly things themselves by better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter into a sanctuary made by hands, a copy of the true one, but heaven itself, that he might now appear before God on our behalf. Not that he might offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters each year into the sanctuary with blood that is not his own. If that were so, he would have had to suffer repeatedly from the foundation of the world. But now, once for all, he has appeared at the end of ages to take away sin by his sacrifice. Just as it is appointed that human beings die once, and after this the judgment, so also Christ, offered once to take away the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to take away sin, but to bring salvation to those who eagerly await him. Cool. So this section, the devotional writer this morning mentions it being kind of about the legality and the structure of Christ's sacrifice, which it kind of just flows right into, it kind of makes sense right after we just talked about the priesthood of God and then how the first covenant is different from the new covenant. We're just kind of in this long section here of talking about what the sacrifice of Christ really means for us and what it really does, and then comparing it to the Old Testament passages. And something that I was struck by, my takeaway from this passage here, is really just, this kind of reminded me of something that I haven't really thought of, but that I've been a little bit in the back of my mind for this whole book, which is he's wanting us to really understand how trustworthy this sacrifice is, and how real and, in this case, legal and potent this act of mercy, this act of salvation for us really was. And it's said sometimes that, we'll sometimes talk about, like, if you ever study apologetics, like, well, you can't argue someone into believing in God, right? Which is true. God has to change your heart, obviously, for that final, transformation process of sanctification to come about. But I think that it's part of God's mercy toward us and part of his love and desire to know us better that he allows us to learn and understand things that make us more willing to trust him, right? Because we're made to trust him, we're made to be united with him completely, but we're in these human bodies with human brains. We're amphibious creatures, like C.S. Lewis says, in heaven and on earth, who need knowledge and who crave knowledge a lot of times. And so this whole book so far kind of makes point after point about Christ specifically. So that's great to read about Christ and about his sacrifice and about what that means for us, but because of this aspect of the structure of it that makes it so believable and so real. It's kind of like C.S. Lewis always talks about Jesus is either a liar or a lunatic, or he is who he says he is. And the writer of Hebrews is kind of saying, listen, like, we saw it happen, he's not a liar. These are the reasons that he's not a lunatic, that this is real, that this is an explanation of how his sacrifice fits into what we already know. This is an explanation of how we know that it works and how we know that we can trust it. So this passage here is really focused on the actual sacrifice part, right? The blood sacrifice, and how the purification has to happen through blood, and that Christ has purified not only the earthly things, but his blood is able to purify the heavenly things. And I thought it was cool them talking about the singularity of Christ's sacrifice, just kind of emphasizing that alongside what we talked about with Melchizedek before, that he's like the priests of old, but he's so much better because he doesn't have to offer sacrifices every year. We don't have to offer sacrifices every year because of him. It was a one-time thing. And this, the notes in my Bible I thought was neat. It says, just as death is the unrepeatable act that ends a person's life, is interpreting like that last verse, Christ's offering of himself for all is an unrepeatable sacrifice that is once for all achieved redemption. So he's comparing it to, he kind of says just in verse 27, which I was confused about this before I read this. Just as it is appointed that human beings die once and after this the judgment. So emphasizing that this is, our deaths are completely unrepeatable. It completely changes the state of what you are. So also Christ offered once to take away the sins of many, not to take away sin, but to bring salvation to those who eagerly await him. So his sacrifice was a one-time thing. It was unrepeatable. It changed the situation of everyone all over the earth, of heaven, purified heaven, one time for all time. It cannot be repeated because it doesn't need to be repeated. And it perfectly mirrors the shedding of blood in the Old Testament, but at the same time, it so much surpasses that because it's not only that it doesn't need to be repeated, that it's literally impossible to repeat it because everything is different now that Christ's sacrifice has occurred. I wanted to read you the Jesus Calling from today, May 20th, right? It's the 20th. Because it's not connected to this verse anyway, but when I was thinking about this verse, these verses making Christ's sacrifice more trustworthy to us, or helping us to see it as so real and potent, helping us to have like the full appreciation for it. And this Jesus Calling is about then kind of what that means for us when we live it out, and what it sounds like and feels like to then turn back to Jesus and accept that forgiveness that we know we have unrepeatably for all time. So I'm going to read this, and then that'll be the last thing. When your sins weigh heavily upon you, come to me. Confess your wrongdoing, which I know all about before you say a word. Stay in the light of my presence, receiving forgiveness, cleansing, and healing. Remember that I have clothed you in my righteousness, so nothing can separate you from me. Whenever you stumble or fall, I am there to help you up. Man's tendency is to hide from his sin, seeking refuge in the darkness. There he indulges in self-pity, denial, self-righteousness, blaming, and hatred. But I am the light of the world, and my illumination decimates the darkness. Come close to me and let my light envelop you, driving out darkness and permeating you with peace.